This year, Metallica reached the top 30 with their album Master of Puppets, and Anthrax, Slayer, and Megadeth each released records on a major label for the first time.
We're sort of like one step, we're like furthest out in like left field pretty much from the middle of any of the sort of bigger heavy metal bands today. You know, sort of as unsafe as you can get. and we get away with it.
Good night! Come on!
Up until then, I was one of those people that hadn't taken them seriously at all, not because they were bad, but because they didn't have what it took to get into arenas and start headlining them and selling millions of records. How wrong can you be? Until Master of Puppets, Metallica were one of those groups who the word cult could have been invented for, really. Those people that knew about their first two albums, Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning, knew they were both great records, knew this was a very unusual band. But for the vast majority of us who weren't really aware of their existence, they weren't on the radar whatsoever.
They had a lot to prove, to be honest, because this was the album where they had to really, really break through, and break through they did. It wasn't so much that they broke through to America, they actually thrust Metallica down America's throat with this incredibly powerful album.
I don't see them ever making another album as good as Master of Puppets. That was a one-off. I can't see them ever having that kind of creative chemistry again. These things happen once in your life if you're lucky.
It's an enormous assault, and it did for Metallica exactly what it needed to do, which was to make them the ultimate t-shirt band for the Mallrats of America. Master of Puppets is the moment where Metallica really became Metallica.
Kill 'Em All came out on a relatively small label. It was released by Megaforce. They were signed by a guy called Johnny Z in the US.
The only thing that frustrates me is the majors did get involved with heavy metal music. It certainly isn't the music that Marsha and I developed back in '83, you know, which was really cool. It was sort of a psychedelic, aggressive kind of a heavy metal music, speed metal, thrash, whatever you want to call it. But Metallica and Anthrax were certainly, and still are today, ahead of their time. Marsha and I pretty much know what the Megaforce sound is. In fact, we have the bands that deliver the Megaforce sound.
That we've been known for, that heavy metal Megaforce sound.
That crunch.
They rushed over from San Francisco to New York to record that album on the back of a demo called No Life Till Leather. And basically Kill 'Em All was those songs produced to album quality in a very short space of time. And they'd also nicked Kirk Hammett from Exodus. He'd come over as well, and they'd gotten rid of Dave Mustaine, who went over to form Megadeth under rather acrimonious circumstances.
We kind of deal more with reality instead of make-believe. You know, we don't sing about Dungeons and Dragons and little fairies and stuff like that. People say that, you know, we have this big war going on, and the war's over because now I made, you know, my mark. These guys have made their mark. You know, we're equal. It's not like, you know, they can't keep me hidden anymore.
Yeah, we're two separate bands, too.
You know, I didn't copy them, I didn't rip them off. I played my own song mechanics, you know, but other than that, you know, we're not ripping them off. This is a separate band, separate music, separate direction, separate attitude.
Prior to Kill 'Em All, metal was heavy metal. It was kind of this, like a rock. It was this thing that lived in the ground and you banged your head to it, and it was a bit beery and a bit kind of staid even. It wasn't overly exciting. With Kill 'Em All, you have this kind of infusion of energy, which for a want of a better word you might describe as being punk. So it wasn't heavy metal, it was metal. It was much sharper, you could cut yourself on it, and it was a bit volatile. The band themselves were volatile. Hetfield was volatile. And it's easy now to read this into it as you look back, because you see the things that happened to Metallica and the things that Metallica became. But that kind of energy and that kind of determination is evident in the music.
Come on, everybody!
Well, by comparison to what they did since, Kill 'Em All sounds pretty, you know, it's unpolished, it isn't the fully finished Metallica beast. But yeah, when it did come out, it did shake up the metal community a little bit. It wasn't out of what they were used to. It was the usual kind of tales of war and death and, you know, the usual extremity you'd expect from that scene. But there was a certain amount of depth to it, and it did show where Metallica were going to be going in future.
I'd seen them live a couple of times, yeah, in clubs in London. It was see 2 or 3 numbers, go to the bar. Once you'd seen 2 or 3 numbers, you'd kind of seen it all. At least that was my view.
Action out there, man! Got yourself some motherfucking whiplash. 1, 2, I.
They were kids. They were really young, really pimply, really long-haired. They thought the longer the song, the louder the song, the more kick-ass it would be. But these were very early days. Their crowd was very easily pleased. Thrash metal was a brand new phenomenon in the same way that punk rock was when the Sex Pistols were doing clubs and colleges. You were kind of absolutely madly into it, or it didn't really mean a great deal. They were a huge hit with fanzines. These days it would have been the internet and websites supporting them. Back then it was fanzines, small metal magazines. In Britain, Kerrang! Magazine was the first national magazine anywhere in the world to put them on the front cover or support them. They really were taken enormously seriously by young fans, young skate kids, thrash metal freaks, but by the critics themselves, the same people that would have been writing about Thin Lizzy or Journey or Iron Maiden in those days. They weren't on the radar whatsoever, and it hurt them a great deal. Lars Ulrich, the drummer, very much the leader of the group and very much a music press devotee, was keenly aware of the fact that Metallica weren't written about in the right places, weren't taken seriously in the right places. You know, the very first album that they recorded was originally called Metal Up Your Ass and featured a fist coming out of a toilet with a sword in it, and they thought that was hilarious. But of course, hilarious as it may have been to them, it wasn't going to cut any ice with Rolling Stone, NME, Village Voice, The Times, The Guardian, and that was really the journey they began with Master of Puppets.
Ride the Lightning was a massive step forward from Kill 'Em All, and what's most remarkable about that is that they recorded it only a year later. So the growth in their music in that time was astonishing. It was a real seismic leap. The difference, I think, was that Kirk Hammett had now been in the band long enough to exert his own influence on the band, which was a considerable one, and they had had many successful tours across the USA. But really, they just came together and they began to develop their music. It became more epic, it became more structured. And for Ride the Lightning, they, of course, decamped to Copenhagen. They had a proper producer, proper studios, and a little bit more time to work on their ideas.
If one bears in mind the recording budgets which they were working to, this was before they had big, huge management. It was before they had a major label representation. So it would have been done cheaply, on the fly. It is a really tight and impressive record. Some of the songs, many of the songs, still hold up today. Creeping Death being one, For Whom the Bell Tolls being another, Trapped Under Ice, Call of Cthulhu. It is a fabulously good record.
I think the thing is with Ride the Lightning, when you first hear it, it is a stunning kind of movement forward, and listening to it in retrospect since and hearing all they've done since, it does kind of deaden that shock value. But with things like you know, For Whom the Bell Tolls as well, this massive sound, you know, the kind of Ennio Morricone soundscapes with Ernest Hemingway, it's just everything about it is huge, it's massive, and that's the thing. But then again, you had it set against the subtleties of Call of Cthulhu, and that's where Metallica really stand out from the crowd. It's just the crescendo sounds so much more powerful because of the respites you get with the quiet passages, which you don't get with a lot of metal bands, and that's why I guess Ride the Lightning was another watershed moment for metal. That's the one where you really start to see that there is a lot more to this band than just another thrash band.
Well, what you had with Fade to Black, For Whom the Bell Tolls and Creeping Death were three very different songs that are all equal parts of what Metallica are about today, the kind of music that they do. Fade to Black is a ballad, albeit it is a very, very dark ballad. It appears to deal with suicide. And that track divided their original fan base straight down the middle. Some of them, the pure thrash fans, thought it was sacrilege that Metallica could do, never mind Fade to Black, but For Whom the Bell Tolls, anything that wasn't pure speed. But the number of fans they lost was nothing compared to the numbers that they gained through doing those tracks. Creeping Death, on the other hand, is still a classic. It is ultimate metal. It's got a huge intro, fantastic riff, amazing flyaway solo from Hammett, lyrical kind of horror movie theme addressing the Egyptian angel of death. And perhaps best of all, that I remember that surging time change as they approached the bridge, where you'd have the festival crowds raising their fists and singing along, you know, "Die by my hand, I creep across the land, killing firstborn man." Classic sort of video nasty era metal. All themes all echoed on Master of Puppets, and I think ever since they'd really found themselves at that time. It's a very important album. In that crucial time between sort of Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, Metallica were seen as being a rapidly rising cult metal band. They were the band that everyone was talking about, the press, the media, the fans. They just hadn't quite broken through to the level where they were headlining their own tours, but it seemed inevitable.
Ride the Lightning had initially come out on Megaforce, but after 3 months it had been picked up by Elektra, and really they put their weight behind it. And consequently, by the end of the year, you know, it sold 500,000 copies, so they were quite big. In the States, they were doing great guns. And then they came over here and played Donington in '84. And this was the occasion when it's kind of known that there were loads and loads of pig parts thrown on stage at Metallica. And most people kind of think of it, oh, somebody threw a pig's head on stage. But since speaking, I spoke to James about it, and he said that by the end of the show, they had enough pig parts on stage that they could have essentially put together a complete animal, because so much of this pork had been thrown at them. I don't know, it's a sign of appreciation, I guess.
Take that with you.
By the time they recorded Master of Puppets, they had heavyweight management in New York, they had a big record deal behind them, and those people very much approached me as one of the key writers in those days that should be covering this band. I was flown out to the studio where they were recording it in Denmark, and I was one of those kind of first wave of so-called serious critics to be very much encouraged to write about the group and take them seriously at last. They were extraordinarily nervous of what the so-called heavyweight journalist would make of it all. The only one that wasn't like that was Cliff. You know, the only one that absolutely didn't give a shit, or if he did, was very good at hiding it, was Cliff. The others were like cats on a hot tin roof. I mean, they were tiptoeing around, they were worried that it wouldn't go well. They were very, very nervous. It was very, very important to them that this album went over big with people that weren't just Metallica fans.
With the exception of magazines such as Kerrang, who will write about them anyway, people aren't writing about Metallica. The NME aren't writing about Metallica. Rolling Stone aren't writing about Metallica. None of these magazines are writing about them, yet here they are. They're on the road with Ozzy Osbourne in the US and basically attracting such a response from the audience that it is really a co-headline tour. In the UK, they were headlining places such as the Hammersmith Odeon, and they are becoming the band to see, and then people are writing about them. So it's a house and a success that's built on the strongest of foundations because it came from the bottom up, not from the top down.
Fleming was a heavy metal fan. Fleming loved Metallica. Fleming wore the same t-shirt, had the same hair, would have had his head flailing back and forth by the bass bin at their concerts. He was like the Uber fan who totally got it. So Fleming, ultimately, it wasn't that he was the most skilled producer in the world. He was the one that had the empathy. He was the one that understood precisely what an opportunity this was for them.
The success of Master of Puppets and the previous album, Ride the Lightning, that Fleming also worked on, was really down to the band. I think Fleming and Rasmussen did a fantastic job of capturing them. But what you're hearing on Master of Puppets is total Metallica. It hasn't been influenced by the producer. He hasn't put his two penneth in, if you like. It is Metallica. At that time, they were firing on all cylinders. They were getting on great, so Fleming didn't really have to do much apart from record what was going on to the best of his ability.
A producer like Bob Rock would have done exactly what he did do 5 years later, which is say this 12-minute song would be way better if we cut out that tedious bit in the middle and made it 5 minutes. Would be way better if we kept the beat all the way through, Lars, as opposed to going off and doing endless paradiddles and trying to show how amazingly competent you are. Just keep a damn beat. I mean, that was half the battle for Bob Rock. And I think more than anything, they had more money to spend. So they could spend longer on the tracks, they could use more machines, more time. They themselves and Fleming pushed themselves as far as they could go. None of them had ever been in that situation where they'd had that opportunity before. And although Lars was very good at pretending it was just another day in the crazy world of Metallica, it was insanely important that this went well.
Battery, it sets out the stall so fabulously well for the album, because no other band, certainly at that level, by which I mean the Iron Maidens, the Motley Crues, whoever, would have attempted such a song. It was fast, it was thrash metal fast. It has a rhythm guitar part that today is still astonishing. It is the meanest right hand in the world, surely. And everything about it is brilliant. The way the tempo splits at the end of the song, it's so exhilarating.
It opens with this kind of very mild Latino-flavoured flurry of acoustic guitars, and then suddenly smack, Lars Ulrich comes in, Kirk Hammett and Hetfield come in, this barrage of noise which quickly escalates through the gears, and it's a full-on opener.
I guess Battery is the one where it just really does smash into you from the beginning. It's as soon as that riff comes in, after a little bit of respite at the beginning, it's just enormous. It really does just power its way through. It's the ultimate Metallica song. It's where it all came together. It's where the kind of subtlety and restraint were kind of put together in the most powerful way with this pounding riff repetition. And for that, it will always be a major part of their live set, because it's the moment. That's where it all came together. And it's probably where a lot of their fans first heard Metallica. This was the album where everybody had to have it. They put it on the turntable, and that's the first thing you'd hear, and that would be your Metallica.
Battery is the perfect opener. In fact, Battery, to my mind, is the perfect song. I don't mean it's the perfect metal song, it's the perfect song. It is brilliant, astonishingly brilliant. It's astonishingly brilliant in how it sounds, it's brilliant in how it's played, and it's also brilliant lyrically, lashing up the action, returning the reaction, smashing through the boundaries, lunacy has found me. These kind of extreme terms, but it sounds like a tornado. It sounds like a tornado ripping apart a trailer park. It's incredibly incredibly accurate. The words and the sounds of the words and the vowels and the rhythm of the words fits the music perfectly. It really is a very accomplished piece of writing, lyrically.
Thank you. Good night.
The title track of any album is always going to be an important track, and on Master of Puppets this is deservedly so, because it is such a huge piece of work.
Master of Puppets is very much the standout track on the album. It's one of those rare songs which I think is 8.5 minutes long, but it doesn't feel overworked. It grabs you by the balls from the outset, basically, and it doesn't let go. You could argue that the track Master of Puppets is actually a miniature version of the album as a whole. It sort of epitomises everything that the album is. The lyrics rather pointedly address drug addiction, which was something Metallica could see happening to their friends. It's about the powerlessness you have of not being able to control a situation that you're in. Musically, it moves from one movement to the other. It surges through these various time changes.
Sing it for me.
Thrash, I think, was a very straightforward thing. You knew what you were getting. It would start off, it would make a lot of noise, it would stop. But Metallica added this element all their own to it, and never more markedly so than on Master of Puppets, because when everything is going along nicely, the riffs built up in its huge way, and then suddenly they're off, and it isn't like it's a strange middle eight, it's a completely bizarre middle eight. It takes you to a totally different world, and it's more than a middle eight, it's like a middle 4 million probably. It goes off noodling away, and then suddenly another riff comes in, which is even more doom-laden than the one that they've left, before at the end they come crashing back in. And it's all down to Cliff Burton. This was he had this kind of very libertine, hippie upbringing, and it just kind of made him open to new ideas and just testing things out. I mean, say when Jason Newsted came into the band, if he had these insane, incredible ideas that would have taken Metallica into a new place, they would have had none of it, because they simply didn't have the enormous respect for him that they did for Cliff. And when Cliff was gone, there was no one to tell them not so much no as yes, this is where we're going. There was no one to kind of take them in these directions, and so they were left with a kind of sense of where to now.
Cliff had actually lost his life in a bus accident on the road to a gig in Copenhagen, 27th of September, '86. This was during Metallica's very first headline tour of Europe. Obviously a tragedy, but what was sad about that wasn't just that he had died so young, but that he had died without seeing the full impact of what he had actually achieved himself on Master of Puppets.
They completely changed after he left, which is one of the reasons why Master of Puppets is still so highly regarded, still so affectionately thought of by their fans, because once Cliff was gone, everything about that group changed. Suddenly Lars and James are now the soul of the group. They're not just the writers and the career decision makers. They're the glue, they're the soul, they're the vibe, they're the direction. And up until then, it had absolutely been Cliff. There's a school of thought that argues that if they hadn't lost him, they may not have become as hugely successful as they did, because there was a line in the sand that Cliff drew which he wouldn't cross, and he wouldn't allow those guys to cross. And one of those would be, for instance, releasing 5 singles from an album, which is what they went on to do just a few years later. Making videos, cutting their hair short, wearing makeup, all the stuff that Metallica went on to do in the 90s really wouldn't have happened if Cliff had still been there.
Well, the thing that should not be does offer a moment of more restrained respite, but only really by comparison to the album that it's a part of. Ostensibly it's about sea monsters or something, you know, your guess is as good as mine, but with the riff of Satan behind it, it really does move into a different area, and it does roll along, and it carries you in, and it's a great head-banging riff. It's a riff that you could really nod the old head to without actually injuring yourself too badly. But it's a great song. It's that riff is just so immense. There's nothing bigger in the metal firmament, but it's just a little bit more considered. If they'd gone at it full tilt, it would have lost the power. Whereas a lot of bands would have gone at it full tilt because they didn't have the restraining Burton in place to say, hey, let's just cut it back, guys. And that's what made them so powerful. It's the moments of respite and restraint, once again, that make the big old crescendo sound really big. Without the white, the black doesn't look so black. Leper Messiah, taken from the David Bowie lyric from Ziggy Stardust. It's once again another excuse for Metallica to get really, really angry, you know. And at this time, James Hetfield would get angry about anything. You could give him a shopping list to sing, and he would probably get incandescently furious about the fact that spaghetti hoops are on it and there weren't any beans on it. You know, he would be driven to fury by this. But yeah, he's just very, very angry, which is, you know, great. This is what we want to see from James. Anger, dominance, submission. We want to be dominated into submission by James Hetfield and his shopping list rant.
Circus comes to town. You play the lead clown. Play, spreading his disease, living by his story. Nay, falling to your knees, suffer for his glory. You will.
Dave Mustaine, the Megadeth frontman who had been part of the early incarnation of Metallica, claimed that Leper Messiah was in fact a slightly reworked version of an old song called The Hills Ran Red that he had penned himself. Metallica vociferously denied that, as you can imagine, though they did concede that it was based on a very old riff, but they denied that Mustaine had issued it. Lyrically, it is superb. It's about the TV evangelists that were very popular in Middle America in the 1980s. That's Jimmy Swaggart, Jim Bakker, and all that crowd. These were guys that made a mockery of true religion. They wanted you to send them money, make donations, for which you would get a place in heaven, or as Hetfield said, make your contribution, you'll get a better seat. In fact, these guys were anything but living the Christian lifestyle. They were flying around in private jets, they were involved in sex and financial scandals. So they were pretty much exposed but they pretty much preyed upon vulnerable-minded middle Americans, which Metallica exposed rather clinically in the lyrics to that song.
Welcome Home Sanitarium is, you know, it is the sound of madness in a way. You do have Hetfield barking at the moon, and it is great, you know. He does sound like he belongs in the sanitarium, but still great tune, you know. Whatever way you look at it, it's still a great tune. He may be kind of going on about bonkersness and strangeness and bizarre madness, but it is a great tune at the heart of it.
I think you can use the term metal classic to describe Welcome Home Sanitarium, because once again it's got everything. It's a successor to Fade to Black. Again, it mirrors the position of Fade to Black that was on Ride the Lightning, but I think it's a better song overall. It's got the light and the shade. It's not quite as bleak as Fade to Black because it does have a very rousing hook. It's got one of Metallica's best, most immediate choruses. Something they're not often given credit for. People think of them as a heavy band. They forget that they actually write bloody good songs as well. And Welcome Home Sanitarium is an example of that. It's got a very rousing hook, easy for an audience to get into. And it moves through the gears like a lot of Metallica songs. It doesn't just stay in one key, it doesn't stay quiet. When Hetfield screams the words, "Just leave me alone," boom, it goes up. And then you'll hear Kirk Hammett coming in and he'll bring it to a very sort of rousing conclusion.
Disposable Heroes, what you have here is basically metal manners and punk mayhem. This is where you get the other side of Metallica, where you see where the whole thrash thing came from, the kind of the metal mightiness that you get from Motorhead and the same velocity, and just the fact that he is relentlessly pounding out the same riff. It is the repetitions that you expect of punk. That's what it is. That's what all it needs to be.
Hetfield is at his best here, moving from one piece to another, really complex riffing. It's one of the most difficult songs for them to play live. It's also very long. But more than angry, I think it's a very, very frightening song because it was recorded 20 years ago, let's not forget. And frankly, it's never been more relevant than it is today.
Orion, it was initially supposed to be joined to Welcome Home Sanitarium as this one big, long, 15-minute piece, which was, you know, even the band realised that this was a step too far. So they chopped it off, and that's why it stands alone with the track on its own. It seems a little bit odd. But you know, you could argue it would seem even odder stuck at the end of Welcome Home going on for 15 minutes. But once again, it's those moments of experimentation and restraint and just trying something new. Soundscapes, Ennio Morricone once again, this whole thing of just, it's like the soundtrack to a film you're not seeing, the soundtrack to a film that's running in Cliff Burton's head. Very probably a spaghetti western. And there you have it. Without it, Metallica wouldn't be the Metallica we know and love. People might skip over it on the album, but you know, it had to be there to make Master of Puppets the album that it is.
In terms of composition, it's actually a slightly gentle piece, really, by Metallica standards. There's a couple of central ideas which they develop and play with. There's a very elegant sort of central section, quite mournful, and in fact the song was played at Cliff Burton's funeral. An interesting point about Orion is at 6 minutes 36 into it, you actually hear a bass solo from Cliff, which a lot of people, me included, did not realise was a bass. He had made his bass sound like a guitar. It's a very, very strange sound. It's quite distinctive. Listen out for it because it just shows what a versatile musician he actually was.
You know, at first it kind of seemed like a fairly inconsequential filler, and then you hear it a few more times, you suddenly start to get it. I think, you know, the albums that one always looks back on more fondly are the ones that take a bit of time to reveal themselves to you. And I think there was one level of taking it and going, well, for what it is, this is really, really good. This isn't my regular round-the-clock listening, but for what it is, this is really as good as it gets. But as time passed, and they worked that album for a very long time, you know, over a year they were touring the world with that, you started to understand, actually, blimey, you know, there might be more going on here than I realised. But some albums have a real consistency to them. They have a real identity, musically, vibe-wise. And they had it on that album like they'd never had it before or have ever had it since. There was something, an essence.
Closing proceedings with the kind of breakneck, hardcore thrashings of Damaging could be seen as a bit of an anticlimactic mistake. It broke the dynamic. It was almost like a step back after you had Orion just taking it in a complete new area. Maybe it was something just to say to the people who complained about Ride the Lightning being a bit of a sellout to the mainstream, look, we can still do this. But it can be looked upon as just a bit of a filler rather than a thriller stuck on the end just to, you know, pad out the album to its immense 50 minutes.
Okay, Damage Incorporated is the closer, and it comes after the relatively gentle Orion. Plus, there's also about a minute-long, sort of dreamlike bass-led intro to Damage Incorporated. So you're almost put into this false sense of security, and then suddenly it comes at you like a greyhound from the traps. It is another full-on thrash metal classic, up there with Battery as one of the greatest thrash metal songs ever written. I mean, it absolutely shreds, and when Hetfield screams the word, "Go!" Kirk Hammett comes out with really one of the fastest, most aggressive guitar solos you will ever hear to this day. Lyrically, it's just about standing up for yourself, fighting the power against all odds. In rather grim detail, has to be said. It's a very violent song. It's a perfect way to close the album. And it's the one deviation they made, funnily enough, going back to the whole idea of Ride the Lightning being a prototype for Master of Puppets. It's the one deviation they made, because on Ride the Lightning they finished with the instrumental Call of Cthulhu. That wouldn't have worked on Master of Puppets, so Ryan would not have been a good way to close the album, because it's just too gentle. You need to close the album with a mighty kick up the arse, just to keep fresh in your mind what a heavy unit Metallica is. So Damage Incorporated does that job perfectly.
The metal media definitely got Master of Puppets. They really saw that this was an interesting move forward. But I don't think it really made an enormous impact initially. You know, with kind of, retrospect, we can see that it is an incredibly important album in the whole, history of metal. But it didn't change the world. It did get them into the American charts. They got into like number 29 on the Billboard charts, which was, quite a big deal, but it wasn't an enormous #1 success or anything. Over here, it didn't really kind of broach the top 40. It did all right, but it didn't take over the world. It just seems like it did when you listen to it now.
There was a great expectation in the media. Mick Wall gave it a 5K review in Kerrang, which is, he was absolutely spot on. He described it earlier as both a bully and a king. So he could see that it was heavy and dark and oppressive, but he could also see that it was thoroughly accessible. This wasn't an album purely for the thrash metal crowd. This was an album for the whole rock metal community, and so it proved. It transcended that whole genre and became a much bigger thing. And it ended up selling 6 million copies in the US alone. To put that in context, Metallica had no airplay and they made no promotional videos. Now this sounds insane now because those things go without saying. Metallica didn't see themselves as a kind of band to do things like that. They didn't see themselves as being a commercial entity. So the fact that they managed to achieve those kind of album sales and that kind of a fan base without airplay, without promotional videos, well, that tells you how great an album Master of Puppets really was.
Do I wish it was longer? Hell no. It's just as long as it ought to be. At the time, 40 minutes was basically what a vinyl album was, and they came out with an album that was over 50 minutes long, with only 8 tracks. Everything just goes into kind of longevity that you don't expect from metal bands. And the fact that now you have metal albums going on for upwards of 70 minutes, it's got absolutely nothing to do with artistic necessity. It's just the CD format. That's what people want from their albums now. And sometimes to their artistic detriment. The stuff that would have been just tossed out on the B-sides of singles is now on the album. And so you don't get albums with the same power as Master of Puppets. I think people now look at it and say, why is it so short? Whereas back in the day, people were looking at it saying, why is it so long? But no, it's exactly as long as it ought to be.
Sing it for me!
While Master of Puppets isn't really the greatest metal album,
ever made. It's certainly in the top 10, if only for its influence and the way that it kind of pushed the envelope of what metal could be and what people expected from metal. It's just the influence that it's had. It's just the way it's made metal bigger than the metal that it's, you know, when they went into the actual making of the album, metal was smaller than what it was at the end of that album. It introduced the world to the Metallica that we now all know and love. And that's why every home should have one.
It's very hard to judge Master of Puppets from a 20-year viewpoint because the death of Cliff 6-7 months after it was released kind of sealed it in a time capsule. If he had stayed with them, the likelihood is they'd have gone on to make an album better and then another one better and so on and so on. And rather than looking back on Master of Puppets as a benchmark or a landmark in their career, we may well have been looking back on it now the same way that one looks at the third Queen album or the third Led Zeppelin album or whatever it might be. You know, it would have been one of many. As it turns out, it was 2 albums in one. It was the first and the last album they ever made where they really captured the essence of what that lineup was about.
I would classify Metallica as a standalone band, in that they were a metal band.